So at this point, we're able to read data from the store, we're able to add data to the store, at least some initial data, and we can output that data on the screen. That's of course all great, but now of course we also want to make sure that these buttons work and that this data can be changed. And for that we need actions, because when using NGRX you don't call reducers yourself. Instead, you dispatch actions, for example, from inside your components, so that NGRX can call those reducers for you, so that those reducers can then work on that latest state that is managed by NGRX and update it accordingly. Therefore, here, back in our application, I will add a new file in this store folder, and I'll name it counter.actions.ts. And of course, it's technically not required to split your code across files like this, but it is something you'll see a lot in all those applications that use NGRX, that you put your reducer in a separate file, that you put your actions into a separate file, and that you put other things about which you will learn later into yet other files. So this actions.ts file is all about defining the actions that can be dispatched in this application. And here in this application, we might want an action for incrementing the counter, for increasing it by 1. Therefore, in this counter actions file, we can create a new constant, because an action is, again, a value in the end, an identifier of a certain action, you could say. And I'll name my constant here increment. And then such an action thing, such an action value is created by calling createAction, which is a function provided by NGRX store, though just as with createReducer, there also is an alternative to calling createAction, which I'll show you later. Now, createAction is a function that needs 1 or 2 arguments, and at least one argument is always required, and that argument is the type of the action, the identifier of the action. And when using NGRX, this identifier, this type, in the end is simply a string. For example, increment, though the content of the string is totally up to you, of course. It just must be some unique identifier, so that in your Angular application, you don't use the same identifier for different actions. That's something that should be avoided, and to avoid it, it's quite common to add kind of a prefix to this identifier, typically in square brackets, though these are all just conventions and not technical requirements, but still, it is a convention you might want to follow. And the convention here is to put the name of the feature of the app to which this action belongs between those square brackets. So here, for example, counter. And if you instead had an action that belongs to the user authentication area, you could use auth instead. So that you have an identifier for the feature of the app to which the action belongs, and then after that, the actual action identifier, for example, increment here. So that's the overall action identifier, and with that action defined here, you can export this action object, which it is under the hood, and then use it somewhere else in your application to execute different logic for different actions. So the question therefore is where you would use this action. And the answer is in the reducer, because that's in the end where the state should be updated. So it's in this reducer function where you want to listen to the action. Now here I'll switch back to the approach that uses createReducer. And when using this approach, listening to actions and executing different pieces of code for different actions is quite straightforward, because you can pass a second argument to createReducer after the initial state, and that argument should be a value that is created with help of another function provided by NGRX store. And that other function is the on function. Though, as mentioned, in the next lecture I will show you what happens under the hood if you're not using createReducer. But here, when using it, you now use the on function and execute this as a second value for create reducer. And this on function then itself needs some arguments. It needs 2 arguments to be precise. And the first argument is the action to which you want to listen. So in this case, this increment action which I created. And for this, you simply import this action from your actions file, and you then use it as a value for on. But that's not all. You now also must pass a second value to on, and that second value must be a function itself, a function that will be executed by NGRX whenever this action occurs, whenever this action is dispatched. And this function here then will be executed by NGRX, and this is the function that should contain the logic that updates the state. For this function will automatically receive the current state as an input. NGRX will pass the current state value for this reducer into this function here whenever this action occurs. And then you should return the updated state. Though what's really important here, really important to keep in mind, is that you should not directly change the existing state, but instead always produce a new value. Which is especially important if the initial state is not a number, as it's the case here, but if this would be an object or array. In that case, you should not directly mutate this array or object, but instead return a new array or object that can be based on the old state array or object. In this case here, it doesn't matter though. Instead, we just want to return a new number, which could either be hard-coded like this, or typically a number that's based on the old number, the old state. So for example here, state plus 1. So with that, this function here will return the old state plus 1. And that will then automatically be used and stored by NGRX as the new state value for the slice of data that's managed by this reducer. So the overall store can still consist of multiple pieces of data, but the piece of data that's managed by this reducer will be updated whenever the increment action is dispatched with help of this function here. So of course this was a lot of talking, but as you can see, in the end it's not a lot of code you have to add here. This is how you can listen to an action and then define the kind of code that should be executed when that action occurs. And therefore there's just one missing piece. We must make sure that this action can occur. And in this app here, that happens in the counter controls component. In there, I have the increment and decrement functions, and at the moment I'm using my old counter service here. Well, that's not needed anymore. Instead, you should get rid of this code that was in there and just keep the empty increment and decrement functions and get rid of this counter service import. And you can now even get rid of the counter service file because we don't need it anymore. And instead, in the counter controls component, we now should also inject the store here, the NGRX store. So with help of this type that's imported from NGRX/store. And then here in increment, you can use this injected store object to call the built-in dispatch method. So before we used select for selecting data, now we're using dispatch to dispatch an action. And now you just need the identifier of the action that should be imported. And here in my case, that's this increment action. Hence, I'll import increment from my counter actions file. And then you must execute this like a function. So in the end, the thing that is returned by create action is a function. Increment here, the increment we're exporting in the end under the hood is a function that can be executed. And it must be executed when dispatching. It's not executed when adding it here to on in the reducer. There we instead just point at it, but it is executed when we dispatch. And that's how such an action can be dispatched. So in the end, you define an action, you can dispatch it, and you listen to it and define what should happen to the state when that action occurs. You can also add data to actions, but I'll get back to this in a second. For the moment, let's just save it like this. And now if I run ngserve again, you see that if I reload and I click increment, indeed this counter changes here. And it changes automatically because we're listening to this observable with help of the async pipe. And that pipe got some work to do because we of course are dispatching this action, which is changing the counter with help of the reducer. And the code is exactly the same, no matter if you're in a standalone component app or in an app that uses ng modules. Either way, you can copy and paste your reducer code into this counter reducer file, copy the counter actions TS file into the store folder, delete this counter service, and in the counter control component, you therefore inject the store also here, like this. And you just have to make sure that store is imported from ngrx and increment, this increment action is imported from the actions file. And the service is then not needed anymore. So the code is exactly the same, no matter if you're building the application with standalone components or with the Angular modules. It always works in exactly the same way.